And we're joined now by one of Ms Truss's predecessors as Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, who's now President, Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee. And good to talk to you, David. Well, selling kidneys and selling children, 1 million children at risk of starvation, it just seems to get ever more desperate.
It certainly is desperate, Mark, but it's not inevitable. There are 2,000 staff of my own organisation, the International Rescue Committee, working across Afghanistan, and we can confirm just how desperate the situation is. The reports of early child marriage, forced child marriage are part of this story, but it's vital that your viewers understand that this is not just an aid problem. There is an aid problem in that there's not enough aid, but if anything, the bigger problem is that the economy has been frozen since the withdrawal of military troops from the US and the UK and elsewhere in August. There's no private sector at the moment. There's no proper banking system, and there's no functioning method of paying salaries to public servants, teachers, nurses, water engineers. And so this is an engineered crisis as a result of international economic policy, not just aid policy. Because of that, it's actually soluble. And we need the British government, the American government, others in positions of power, yes, to increase their aid. But I'm also here to tell you that unless you can get the economy functioning by releasing assets to give liquidity to the banking system, by ensuring that public servants are paid through the World Bank, we're not going to be able to avoid this crisis, which is so bad that more Afghans are now at risk of dying from malnutrition than died in 20 years of war.
But as you say, you know, the truth is the West has allowed this to happen. I was seeing figures today that the UN is forecasting a 20% contraction in GDP in Afghanistan by the end of this year. During Syria's civil war, that took 5 years to happen. I mean, this is an economic collapse of startling proportions that the West is allowing to happen.
Well, I would say that it's an economic strangulation, Mark. And if I tell you that 40% of the economy was made up in development assistance, that's salaries for teachers, nurses, etc., and that has ended, you can see quite what a tourniquet has been applied to the Afghan economy. We as aid providers, those 2,000 IRC staff that I referred to, it's like they're running up an escalator, but the escalator is going down, an economic escalator is going down much faster than they can run up. And this is the result of policy. We need the British representatives at the World Bank to be saying, spend the $1.2 billion of the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund that you're sitting on, spend it now on paying salaries. We need the British representative at the IMF to be saying, look, we have to address this frozen assets issue because there's no liquidity for this import-dependent economy to buy food, fuel, and medicines. We need, yes, the UN appeal for aid to be met too, and that's a responsibility of the US, UK, etc. We've got to address this. Otherwise, it's not just Afghans who are going to be left in starvation. It's Europe that will face a migration crisis and the West that will face an intolerable stain on its reputation.
But this all requires, David, Western governments and those organisations you've just mentioned to effectively, you know, hold their noses and release these funds to the Taliban to stage off this, massive humanitarian disaster.
But let me correct you, if I may, on one thing, Mark.
Yeah.
Paying a nurse in Herat is not paying the Taliban. Paying a teacher in Mazar-e Sharif is not paying.
But how do you set that up, that process, without involving the regime, which, whether you like it or not, is running the country?
Well, already the World Bank is allowing those staff who are employed by NGOs to be paid in health centres, but we know that more than half of the country's civil servants are teachers. But paying them through international institutions, including World Bank or UN institutions, has been done in other places. For example, in Yemen, it's been done in part in Afghanistan, but needs to be scaled up dramatically. Paying public servants doesn't mean paying the people who are running their departments. It means getting money into the hands of people in need. It also, releasing the banking system allows Afghanistan's private sector to function. So this is a really fundamental choice. If you believe that keeping people alive is not worth it, not you. If the authorities believe that keeping people alive is not worth it, that is not just a story about their morality. It's also a story about their inability to distinguish between punishing a government they disagree with and punishing people who've done wrong.
Well, exactly. But it just seems to some, I'm sure, hypocritical, certainly to the Afghans, to rattle for the West, to rattle their charity tins with one hand and then impose sanctions and block funds with the other hand.
Totally. And it's also stupid, frankly. It's not just hypocritical, it's stupid, because the worse the economy is, the more aid they need. And Afghanistan is going to have an economic contraction as a result of the end of the war economy and of all that goes with it. But there's a difference between an economic adjustment over time and an economic strangulation, what you called an economic collapse, in the space of months. Remember, it's only 4 months since British troops left Afghanistan. And we know from experience that you can get money into the right places. What we've got to have, though, is the will to see it through. And we're putting pressure here in the US. The US government has already done some carve-outs for humanitarian organizations from the sanctions regime, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. And we spent 20 years in Afghanistan. You can argue about that. You can argue about the withdrawal. But the people who you've just featured in Alex Crawford's unbelievable film in some ways, they're no one's enemy. They're people to whom promises were made. And those promises have to be fulfilled if we're to hold our heads up.
OK, well, look, we've got 20 seconds left. The next few months, you know, winter and all that, what is the prospect if we don't get money and aid in there now?
We haven't got months, Mark. I'm on this as a matter of days.
Right.
We've waited for months and we've seen the results. 1 million kids are at the risk of starvation, according to the United Nations. We've got days to sort this out, and it is sortable. That's the biggest message I can give you. There's no excuse, because this is sortable.
All right. David Miliband, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.